This video will contain artistic depictions of top surgery scars. In 1990, Judith Butler wrote the groundbreaking Gender Trouble on the Performance of Gender. They would argue that gender is not biological, but instead, something constructed and enforced through the repetition of acts and behaviors in a social performance which imitates culturally prescribed and impossible ideals. Over 30 years later, where or how do we find ourselves performing? Today, I will be examining how genderqueer bodies are currently being constructed and maintained online through art shared on Twitter. The research emerging from my examination can be imagined as falling into the overlapping studies of online artistic expression and the mechanics of digital visual participatory spaces intersecting to create a cyberqueer identity, all of which already acknowledge and analyze the general idea of online artistic expression being more than just a passive production of art, but also a reflection of oneself. John A. Barr, Caitlin Y.A. McKenna, and Grain M. Fitzsimmons suggest that the true self is more easily expressed on the internet due to a relative anonymity and less consequences for non-normative identities. This academic conversation on the online construction and maintenance of identity is also found in early concepts of the cyberqueer from the late 1990s, with the pioneering essay Cyberqueer by Nina Wakeford specifically examining queer identity online. She references Dawson in describing how entering cyberqueer spaces, which in the 2000s were newsgroups, email discussion lists, chat rooms, and websites, feels like arriving in an existing place where not only will we feel at home, but we are even the natural majority. Brady Roberts, Brendan Churchill, Sun Vivian, Benjamin Hankel, and Paul Byron revealed this phenomenon still persists 2 decades later, where the internet continues to be a significant resource for young LGBTIQ+ people, where queer people now connect via dominant mainstream social media platforms to explore their sexuality and gender identity and connect with others like them. The scholars also more specifically reference Tumblr in being used by the queer community to connect, find comfort, be part of communities, and learn about diverse genders and sexualities. Further dissection of the cyberqueer reveals a key theme of the construction of identity. For instance, the cyberqueer is seen as the inclusion of all non-normative sexualities and identities, as well as the fluidity and/or performativity of such identities, evident in the maxim that you can be whoever you want to be in cyberspace. Anonymity online means that users begin with no body and are free to construct and/or reconstruct the physical descriptions of themselves at any moment. However, Wakeford notes that this supposed inclusion and representation of all in cyberqueer spaces isn't always true, where the ideas of attaching identity to one's physical body becomes imperative to deciding who can and cannot have access to the cyberqueer space. The question might no longer be, are you lesbian, but are you lesbian enough to participate? This kind of policing continues to be found in today's Tumblr, where several respondents from the 2018 survey Scrolling Beyond Binaries discuss how the intense strive to define vocabulary, circulate perspectives on power, and generally tackle challenging ideas can be experienced and levied as a negative style of policing. Abigail Oakley and Avery Dame Griff discuss how tags, a site-specific design similar to hashtags which help users to establish their self-identity for others, becomes a catalyst for discourse of who belongs in the transgender community, since the terminology can often be so limiting in putting people with differing opinions under the same tag. For instance, there is a divide as to whether gender dysphoria and a desire for change is necessary to qualify as transgender, and this is where we see how a conflict in perspectives from gatekeeping arises. Similarly, Wakeford poses further questions with the gaps in cyberqueer studies itself, where there exists very little material on transgender experience despite the widespread participation of transgender users in diverse cyberqueer forums, and an uneven focus on textual cyberspaces rather than those of graphical forms. This is where this video's examination of genderqueer bodies through art on Twitter begins to offer the cyberqueer studies. In doing so, we might also try to address the question which Wakeford poses. What precisely does the cyberqueer add to the queer identity which it previously lacked? Given how producing and consuming cyberqueer spaces must work within the technical possibilities of the online and their ability to represent and construct identities, What can art shared on Twitter through its design offer the construction and maintenance of the identities of queer users? How is this done? And what are the consequent benefits and limitations? We might begin to find our answers with an interview with Noah, a transgender artist on Twitter creating queer art. Also known as Noah Dia Art on Twitter, Noah is a Vietnamese trans-identified illustrator who currently resides in Australia, who draws inspiration from queer identities, emotions, and warm, bright colors. He has around 95,000 followers on Twitter, with numerous of his queer original artwork reaching up to 50,000 likes, and he has also been commissioned by Warner Brothers and Amazon Prime for his queer artwork. Regarding his reputation on a more public level, he also began the Draw Your Baby Girl in This drawing trend, which brought the artistic community together and received around 9,000 quote retweets of artists participating in the trend he began. The trend itself has even earned its own Know Your Meme page. This being said, he's a very notable figure in the queer art community on Twitter, and when I reached out for a potential interview, he was extremely enthusiastic about it. We shared a conversation on Discord where over several questions on his work as a queer artist making queer art on Twitter, I observed several recurring themes on the personal construction and public maintenance of a genderqueer identity, which I now hope to further dissect through an analysis bringing in the significance of artistic expression as well as a participatory culture. For instance, he talks a lot about the desire for an ideal self in his drawings, where drawing what one does not or cannot have is a means of exploration. Here, we see the creation of a set of standards created by the Cyberqueer, one that the creator himself desires, in the safety of a digital visual space. Artistic expression has always been seen as a means of self-identification and affirmation, where Victor Lowenfeld, in Creative and Mental Growth, argues for how the most basic factor of any creative expression is the expression of the self. He elaborates further in highlighting the significance of the creative self-expression, where the satisfaction derived from expressing one's feelings and emotions in art has always been closely studied to result in higher self-esteem in children and positive self-perception in college students. Almost 80 years later, after the first edition of Lowenfeld's publication, Noah talks of how his art began as a personal projection, wanting his works to be unapologetically queer. Therefore, we continue to witness the same creative expression of the self. Digital visual spaces through social media, a recent technological development Wakeford or Lowenfeld do not discuss in their 20th century text, has only further enabled this, especially through the phenomenon Henry Jenkins terms a participatory culture. He refuses the passive spectator culture found in the cries of the demise of the audience and returns power to the audience in how they interact with media through the active production of one's identity, when fans express their independent interpretations through informal cultural productions. But as Wakeford previously noted with the uneven access to the cyberqueer, Jenkins similarly acknowledges that those from marginalized identity groups struggle to identify with mass media and thus must fight for inclusion in a digital visual space that usually forgets and or excludes them. For instance, Zena Hutton praises how fans on Tumblr give their favorite characters queer and gender identities that match theirs through fan art. And similarly, Noah talked about how he designed and came up with different headcanons for the characters from the podcast Time Bombs, where he reimagines Midland as transmasculine and Radio Bob as gender nonconforming. Lowenfeld considered the ability to identify with oneself, to identify with others, to identify with a product and be able to say, "This is mine," absolutely important for an art program in secondary schools, and today we might find a similar site to be Twitter for finding oneself through art. The freedom found in being able to set problems and goals for oneself and to be responsible for the direction and method of expression can be found on Twitter, where Noah describes the ease of sharing art on the platform. He makes a comparison that Instagram has a gallery-style layout, which creates an expectation for a portfolio-like consistency of finished artworks, and even shares later that since it's not possible to post finished pieces every day, Instagram has begun to hide his posts. The lack of this pressure on Twitter thus makes it more comfortable for him to just post a sketch or unfinished works, and, in his words, his ramblings more often. Consequently, Twitter comparatively allows for a more casual and relaxed development and expression of the self without much concern for aesthetics or the algorithm. He also shares that he enjoys Twitter due to the community and interactions he has. Since Twitter is a more dominant mainstream social media platform, rather than Tumblr, which is dedicated to particular niches, we have the ability to observe the performance of queerness in what Wakeford described as ambiguously labeled cyberspaces, where the cyberqueer is no longer a given, but a site of contestation. And so, when Noah shares all the positive queer experiences he still had despite the openness of the platform, the presence of this community becomes even more significant. Noah talks about how heartwarming it was for him when the creators of Time Bombs reacted positively to his art of Radio Bob being portrayed as gender nonconforming, and how sharing his artwork on Twitter frequently sparked conversations of people sharing their own stories in the replies, even leading him to meeting some followers in person at local markets. When talking about the influence of his art on his followers and just how it generally echoes around on Twitter, Noah emphasizes the necessity to just have queer art that exists, where especially with the fear-mongering of genderqueer bodies, that it is important to normalize these bodies through art. He shared how he's received messages on how his portrayal of the transgender experience as something to be loved through his intimate queer artworks has made people less afraid to be trans, and I think that's just a really beautiful and insightful anecdote into how communal and social the art and the cyberqueer can be online. Here we see comments under several of Noah's works sharing their excitement and adoration over representation of transgender bodies in his art, and replies from other genderqueer users under a comic of Noah sharing his experience of coming out to his partner, and how they were similarly moved and inspired. Noah says of the relationship between his art and his community, "I believe the community has always existed. It is the artwork and love for the same thing that draws people in and allows them to share that connection." This sort of social nature of sharing art online is reflected upon when Brian L. Jones, What Art Education, can learn from how an artistic community operates and functions on the online platform DeviantArt, and finds that the cyberspatial post-industrial or participatory culture mindset encouraged on the platform prioritizes experimentation over normalization, innovation and evolution over stability and fixity, creative innovative rule-breaking over generic purity and policing, and offers an increased opportunity for peer-to-peer learning and the diversification of cultural expression. Ultimately, his analysis reveals 7 educational implications constituting new literacies for art education. In particular, multimodal assessment, teaching as participatory sharing, and collective and autonomous learning are exceptionally relevant in showing the influences of art on the construction of an individual's identity within a community. All of this demonstrates the ability of online artistic expression to teach and learn a set of standards that can be created, circulated, and ingested, thus showing how genderqueer art does not just possess the power to transform oneself, but an entire community too. This set of standards, this ideal self created by the cyberqueer, is now also simultaneously presented to other cyberqueers on the platform. And while this can be most explicitly exemplified by genderqueer artists sharing more technical tutorials of how they draw their art, it is also more subtly exemplified in the symbol creation of cyberqueer bodies in art to be shared. Studying this becomes especially important when not everyone agrees with these standards. Noah mentions how after sharing art of a pregnant trans man, someone reached out to him about how that particular piece of art gave them dysphoria, and they had a discussion about it afterwards. And this isn't just exclusive to Noah and his works either, where a recent trend on Twitter asking artists to share how they draw themselves exposes how the relationship between art and identity can be a complicated one for genderqueer artists. Aaron and Giolini on Twitter responds to the trend and how the last self-portrait they drew in 2017 caused them a lot of anxiety and dysphoria. When someone replied to their tweet sharing they thought being able to draw means being able to draw an ideal version of yourself, which is what Noah talks about with his own drawings, Aaron clarified, stating drawing an ideal self they believed they could never achieve hurt them and made them dislike themselves. This is reminiscent of what Wakeford discussed with the policing of access to the cyberqueer space. Using Oakley and Dame Griff's example of textual tags on Tumblr and who qualifies in belonging to the transgender community again, this conflict of what it means to be genderqueer continues to be an incredibly personal one for visual artworks on Twitter. Queerness isn't always visible, nor does it need to be, so how do you communicate that in a visual medium without being reductive and exclusionary? Since queerness can be such a personal part of one's identity, which can never really have a blanket response, I think it's easy to become kind of fatalistic with this sort of questioning. Maybe there will never be a universal right way to go about this, but I think it's just as important to address the potential for conversation and not just conflict with sharing art on Twitter. When Lowenfeld talks of the necessity of self-identification in art, he also talks of the need for the ability to identify with others and how the latter is dependent on the former, where only through self-identification can we begin to identify with others. The process of creation involves incorporating the self into the activity, and as the artist learns to appreciate and understand their environment by becoming involved in it, the artist develops an attitude that helps them understand the needs of others. The casual, social, and visual nature of Twitter seamlessly allows for both art and conversation between both artist and audience to facilitate the understanding of what others go through in facing their own experiences. Going back to Aaron's interaction on self-portraits and dysphoria, the conversation between the two ended with their commenter sharing their sympathies and a gif of a virtual hug being sent, and Aaron replying with a smiling and blushing emoji. While this side of interaction can easily turn sour, that should not disregard the ability of Twitter to facilitate conversations to talk through possible miscommunications. Beyond sites of conflict, art on Twitter can also become productive sites of conversation and empathy. Our discussion of the cyberqueer and creative expression have acknowledged how easy it is to find ourselves and put that out for the world to see online. And this has its wonders of finding community and affirmations, and its shortcomings of policing and disagreements. Ultimately, we are all trying to figure out what makes us feel good and safe and happy amidst everything that is constantly happening everywhere all at once online. And it's difficult, it really is, but we are all in this together. And I believe genderqueer art on Twitter makes it easier to find the magnum opus that is our beautiful, beautiful cyberqueer body, one retweet at a time.